So how do we do well on an exam? Well, contrary to what some people might say, I actually really like note cards. I really like using note cards when I was a student, and I really suggest that my students use note cards. Now, there is one big limitation with note cards. Big limitation is that if you just memorize the information that we've talked about in class, you're going to forget it. That's how it works. If all you do is the night before the exam, you cram a bunch of stuff from a bunch of note cards into your head, you're probably not going to do well on the exam. And worse, and this is a big worse, you won't leave that exam with any learned knowledge. You might have learned a little bit. You might be able to kind of recognize stuff in the future, but you won't have really learned the material. So what I suggest is by starting a week in advance, and that is a key. We have to start a week in advance. Let's learn all those note cards that very first day. And I actually suggest that you have at least 100 note cards per exam. I know that sounds crazy, but try it out. Just give it a shot. If maybe your exams haven't been quite as good as you hoped that they would be, or maybe you struggle with the exams, just try this out. Just try it once and just see what happens. But what I would do is I would start a week in advance. I would have about 100 to 150 note cards. And what I would do is I would start with the first 5. I just look at the first 5 note cards. I'd go through them one after the other until I could just rattle them off, where I could just do it without even thinking about it. I could rattle them off. Then I'd go on to the next set of 5. And I would have piles of 5 note cards next to my couch. And I would go on to the next set of 5. I would go through those until I could just rattle them off, rattle them off, rattle them off. Well, next, I would go through all 10 of them. And then I'd do the next set of 5. Then I'd go through all 15 of them. Once I would hit 15, I would put those set of 15 away, and I would go on to the next set of 15. And I'd do the same thing, 5 at a time until I could go through all 15. And then I'd go on to the next set of 15. And you do all of this in one day. I call that the crappy day. And that's 7 days before the exam. I mean, think about it. Let's say you're enrolled in 3 courses. That means maybe you have 3 exams per course. That's 9 days. That's 9 exams, right? It's going to be 9 crappy days. That's what I say. I mean, this is how I used to study. I would look myself in the mirror. I'd wake up that day and I would say, today's going to be a crappy day. And I would cram. We already know that students cram quite a bit. Maybe the night before the exam, maybe 2 nights before the exam. I understand that cramming happens. All I'm asking you to do is start that cram a week in advance. Still cram the information all in one day. I want you to learn all these note cards in one day. Bear with me. Just bear with me here. So you learn them all that first day. That's the crappy day. The next day, I want you to try to learn them all again. And what's going to happen is when you first start, you're going to feel like you have learned nothing. It's remarkable. You always feel really bad that second day because you crammed that day before. And that's why oftentimes when you cram just one day before the exam doesn't go so well. But we're doing this 7 days before the exam. And what's going to happen is that second day when you review these note cards, you're actually going to learn them a lot faster. That first day might take 3 to 4 hours. Second day, probably an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours tops. Every day after that, it's going to go even faster. So you're just going to continue to review those note cards after that second day. Continue to review them. Maybe you're standing in line to get lunch. Pull out your note cards. Why not? Why not use that time? Use that time effectively. And just continue to rehearse those note cards. Do them term and then definition. Switch it. Do definition and then term. Ask yourself questions on these note cards. No one ever said that you had to just do definitions and terms. You can ask yourself questions. Write your own exam questions. Put them in there. And then you switch the order, because oftentimes order effects. We just memorize the order and then we're able to rattle them off. Switch everything up. Make it really hard on yourself. But then, and this is the key and this is where all the learning happens, I want you to then go back to your notes and just look at your notes and just say, can I explain this concept? Can I explain this thing? Can I back up my explanation of this thing? And if the answer is yes, don't trust yourself. Don't trust yourself. We lie to ourselves all the time when we say that the answer is yes there. Because I, myself, I would get onto an exam And I would have this thought in my head like, oh my gosh, I've seen that before. I know what it is. I just can't put it into words. What that means is that you probably don't quite know it yet. You've had some exposure to it. Maybe you recognize it, but you don't actually know that thing yet. And so what I suggest that you do is when you come back to your notes, now we're like 3 days before the exam. We crammed everything that one day. We continue to restudy those note cards. It took about 3 to 4 hours that first day, maybe 2 hours the second day, maybe half an hour every day after that. Now it's 3 days before the exam, and we go back to our notes now. And we look at our notes and we say, can I explain this thing? Can I explain this concept? Can I talk through it at an easy to understand level that is not just reiterating what Connor had said in class? Can I truly talk through that? If the answer is yes, remember, we lie to ourselves. You got to do it out loud. You got to do it out loud. So if the answer is yes, I want you to talk through it out loud. Tell me about that concept. Tell the wall about that concept. Tell the mirror about that concept. Tell your roommate about that concept. If the answer is yes, I need you to say it out loud. And if you're able to talk through it, fantastic. You can put a check mark next to that. You've probably learned it pretty well. Continue to just make sure that you remember it over the next couple days. If you don't, if you can't talk through it, that is the stuff that you need to study. Whenever I talk to a student who didn't do quite as well on an exam as they had hoped, I say, was this a little bit fuzzy when you were studying through the material? And they say, yeah, I didn't quite understand that. That's where we need to lean in. We need to ask me questions. If you don't, if you're the night before the exam, I can't really answer your questions. But if it's 3 days before the exam, as I'm suggesting, well, shoot, now you can come to me, you can ask me those questions. And then just continue to study. By the time the night before the exam rolls around, you've studied for about 4 hours that very first day, about 2 hours the next day, maybe an hour, maybe even half an hour most of the other days. A lot of times when I would get to that night before the exam, I would actually feel guilty. I would feel guilty because I felt like I knew the material and I didn't need to study anymore. It was remarkable because I spread that out and because I continued to rehearse and learn and talk through that material. I had learned it so well that the night before I felt like there wasn't any more studying to do. And then you can go to bed early. You can feel good about that next day. You come in and you demonstrate that learning and you rock that exam. Let's do it. Why not? Let's try something different. That is how I suggest to all of my students that you should study for the exams in my courses and any course. I have never seen a course that I could not apply that study skill to. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. And also let me know if you take it up. Let me know if you try it. And let me know how the results are. Try it in all of your classes. Have a great day.